Greetings, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. So this is going to be the long requested video on Robert Emmet. So who was Robert Emmet? Robert Emmet is best known for having been an Irish revolutionary who attempted to break us out of the United Kingdom in 1803. We'd only just joined on New Year's Day, 1801. So he was 25 years old at the time. Robert Emmet, he was born into a well-to-do family in Dublin, and his ancestry was largely English, might even been entirely English. Look at his surname, but his family had been in Ireland for over a century prior to his birth, so they perceived themselves as Irish, and indeed they were. He spoke English and could not speak the Irish language. So his father was Thomas Addis Emmet, and his brother was also a prominent figure. His father was a distinguished doctor. His father was a distinguished doctor. His brother was a barrister who later moved to the United States and was Attorney General of New York. So he grew up in comfortable circumstances, and obviously population was much lower then than it is now. Well, there were about 4 million people in Ireland at the time, whereas there are well over 6 million now. I mean, Dublin was certainly a lot smaller because we're much more of a rural country. Obviously, we've piled into the capital with industrialisation and so on. So many people had to be farmers back then, in days of fairly low tech. The agricultural revolution was just going in Ireland back then. So he was baptised into the Church of Ireland and raised in that denomination. Remembering in Ireland that approximately 70% of us were Catholics back then, might have been higher. Well, 80% probably an exaggeration. And so there's that Protestant minority, and about half of them were members of the Church of Ireland, perhaps 12% of the population, and they were the Aristos, because the best schools were Church of Ireland schools. The only university, Trinity College Dublin, was run by the Church of Ireland, would have been kind of bilingual, Cork, and that was that. And the landlord is usually Protestant, not necessarily Church of Ireland, mostly. Could be Methodist. Methodism came to Ireland not long before. Remember, John Wesley visited every Irish county, with the single exception of Kerry. The Baptists were there, the Religious Society of Friends and Quakers. Anyway, so Emmet, he got to know many people who were in the Society of United Irishmen. The United Irishmen founded in 1791, if memory serves, shortly after the French Revolution, which of course sent shockwaves through Europe. And these radical ideas, they, what was the word? Reverberated isn't quite it. Anyway, they struck a chord with people in Ireland and elsewhere of saying to get rid of feudal privileges. Well, we actually didn't have feudalism in Ireland. Okay, we had landlordism, and no discrimination on the grounds of religion. Remember, the Protestant minority, Jews, and indeed actors were the three despised minorities who were discriminated against in France, and freedom of expression. We actually had very extensive freedom of expression in Ireland in the 1790s that was considerably curtailed. The definition of sedition was broadened greatly, and things like that. More rational reform. Okay, so we had our Irish Parliament. Well, I'm slightly going back because Emmet really becomes famous after the Act of Union kicked in 1801. But only a small minority of men, perhaps 5% of men, had the right to vote. They had to own a lot of real property, which could be a field or usually houses. So those who own a property of above a certain value were permitted to vote. Women are all disbarred from voting, and Catholics, we gained the right to vote in 1793. Thank you. Wishing you a Merry Christmas. So he said, well, we should have complete equality between all religious denominations. We ought to permit every man to vote. He wasn't into women's suffrage at all. Feminism was in its infancy back there. Mary Wollstonecraft had just published her Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Hello there, Sutherland 9 from the United States. So he didn't concern himself with that because that was just so radical. It was hard for people to even address their minds to the notion of female emancipation. So Emmet, he went up to Trinity College Dublin, and he distinguished himself there in debating, for instance. Obviously, the curriculum was mostly comprised of the classics of Latin and ancient Greek, but that led into history and philosophy and so forth. And his mind was engaged by public affairs, so he was a most lively character, and got to know everyone who was anyone in Dublin, including some people who were in the United Irishmen. So he didn't participate in 1798, perhaps surprisingly, even though he just reached adulthood at the time. Well, he was 20 at the time, so could have easily taken part. I mean, boys who were in their early teens in some cases took part in the sort of Jacquerie part of it, because not wanting to go too much into 1798, there's this United Irishmen, this clandestine organisation, of course, had been proclaimed illegal by 1798. They organised their uprising in Dublin, but obviously it was in Wexford and also in Down and Antrim in particular. But there was the organised part by that small group of intellectuals, about half of whom were Protestants. And the north is kind of mixed Catholic and Protestants. In Wexford, is almost exclusively Catholic. People who are not actually members of the United Irishmen would have had only the foggiest notion of what its objectives were generally against the government, against the crown. Now, this is break the connection with England. We weren't actually part of the United Kingdom at the time, so it boomeranged spectacularly in that the Act of Union was brought in only 2 years later. There was a funny supporting comedian, Emmet, only Emmet, I can't recall his name, I'm afraid, so I should listen. Yeah, it makes me remember, you may have seen Spies Like Us, this hilarious 1980s film starring, got Dan Aykroyd and Chevy Chase and a few others, Frank Oz, and, well, some English model. Anyways, it's a sort of Cold War farce. But anyway, Chevy Chase plays a character named Emmett Fitzhume, who's meant to. Hello, hello. Emmett was practicing at the bar. Will this come back? Hello, hello. When's it going to come back? Are we back? Oh, yes, we're back again. Sorry, I got cut off for a minute. I was saying Emmett was practicing at the bar, but he would expatiate on the wickedry of the crown and the union to anyone who cared to listen. So that did not do his career that much good. He was having difficulty getting briefs, and he wasn't going to get preferment within the legal system. So he started a liaison with a young lady named Sarah Curran, who was just a little bit younger than him, and she was the daughter of a very celebrated barrister named John Philpot Curran, who came from Cork. Hooray! And actually, notably, the last Conservative MP in County Cork till the 1870s was Nicholas Philpot Leader. It often made me think, were they related? Because they both had that surname, Philpot. And I thought, Leader, what a great surname for a politician. Or was that nominative determinism, which is a petty fixation of mine? Anyway, so in 1803, he was plotting his rebellion. And what was his objective? That was to have a general uprising in Ireland, obviously defeat the Crown forces. The British Army was there. Our Irish Army had been merged into the British Army after 1801. There was the yeomanry as well, as in these men who owned horses, who were part-time cavalry, do your ordinary job, sub-military training. There was militia, who tended to be lower middle class or even upper working class, had to own your uniform, your musket, who were for the crown, swear an oath to the crown, could be Catholics, could be Protestants. Got to defeat them as well. But anyway, completely break Ireland away from Great Britain, set up a republic, and introduce equality for all males. Remember, the French Revolution was not long before, started long before. I know France had devolved into a military dictatorship with this cult of the personality around Napoleon Bonaparte, turned himself into a Caesar figure. So for many radicals, it was a very lugubrious degeneration, and they lamented the way that France had turned into something which wasn't really to be admired. French help would have been very handy. He didn't secure, or even I think attempt to secure it, whereas that been a major part of the United Irishmen's plot for 1798. Of course, they tried to get the French there in 1796. Wolfe Tone had been aboard this French ship and going into Bantry Bay in 1796. That being one of the largest natural harbours in the world. But these ferocious gales had kept his squadron at bay. He was anchored off Ahabeg in the Beara Peninsula. As he said, he was so close he could have spat onto the land. England has not had such an escape since the Armada he fulminated. But curiously, Emmet doesn't seem to have even tried to do that. Why? Maybe he thought that they might try and take over, because don't forget that France had invaded lots of other European countries. Napoleon He was about to proclaim himself emperor, putting his sisters and brothers on the thrones of Europe, having his sisters marry various potentates and annexing more land to France, making these countries really satrapies of France. And he didn't want Ireland to be a mere satellite of the French, and that was one of the things the government had used against the rebels in 1798. Oh, really, they're just French agents to delegitimize them. And of course, you'd have to be real naive to think that the French gave a fig about us, and they would just wanted to turn us into a satellite of France. Would that have been better than what we had in 1803? It might have been, actually. Napoleon wasn't all bad. So he had a factory making weapons secretly. Obviously, things had to be done by subterfuge, because if the government found out what was happening, he was for the chop. But there was a premature explosion in one of these subterranean factories, and then, what was I going to say? The cat was out of the bag. You couldn't conceal that, so he had to prepone, as the Indians would say, his plan for a revolt. Merry Christmas there, Dang Tran, and not Tranny, I don't think, because otherwise they're all going to be rounded up. He didn't want the crown to roll up what was happening. Remember Dublin Castle, that was the centre of the government in Ireland. They had paid informants everywhere. People would do it for money. People would do an ideological conviction out of vengeance, for a sense of pride. There are all sorts of psychological reasons why somebody turns an informer. Might have joined the organisation sincerely or become disillusioned for whatever reason. Might have been caught and said, well, we could easily have you executed, but we'll let you off so long as you go back and be our mole inside the organisation. But he does appear to have been infiltrated by moles. They had to keep it quite small, because this is always the trade-off that conspiracies take. You need as many people on board as possible to give it the best chance of success. But every time you take someone in the circle of trust, you're taking a risk. This person could be a double agent, or even just could blurt it out, or could just be foolish and easily get arrested. So they had to go ahead with a rebellion, but it really just turned out to be a street brawl in Dublin, in front of Dublin Castle. Their attempt to storm the castle really was a joke, didn't get anywhere, and so it was quite squalid. They killed Lord Kilwarden and his nephew, because their horse-drawn coach was going into Dublin Castle, and it was stopped and attacked by some of his people. It seemed to be more like a mob. So the whole thing was an ignominious failure, and they were arrested by government agents pretty quick. We didn't have police as such in Ireland. We didn't have the Irish Peace Preservation Force yet, which was the embryonic police force. Anyway, so that was 1803, and he was put on trial. Um, uh, so he'd been in hiding for some time, and they arrested Anne Devlin, who was his girlfriend's maid, because he'd concealed himself in some friend's house. They were helping him out, and so they thought, where is this guy hiding out? Somewhere in Dublin. Has to be close to Sarah Curran. And Anne Devlin and her relatives were arrested. Where was he to find out? They did eventually arrest him. So then Anne Devlin was there, held in prison for quite a long time. He tried to persuade her to just to fess up, to tell them useful things so they wouldn't mistreat her in prison. She was eventually released after about a year in prison, and lived on to fairly ripe old age. So there's a song about her. She lived in the liberties of Dublin towards the end of her life. That's an area right in the heart of the city, near the Temple Bar. So he's put on trial. So what has really allowed him to stake his claim to a place in Irish history is his exceptionally truculent and eloquent speech from the dock when he was on trial for his life. Remember, they had preferred a charge of high treason against him, the penalty for which was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, which is a particularly gruesome manner of death. Now, I'm unsupportive of the death penalty, but if we're to have it at all, could the death not be as quick and as painless as possible? The death stroke is probably delivered by a headsman or something in those days. Might be almost painless, or just, I don't know. They hadn't developed the short drop yet. Hanging people with slow strangulation. These were very dark and brutal times. Okay, the death penalty was used promiscuously, just for stealing things. Oh, you might say, oh, British rule so terrible. Of course, we were British. It wasn't just British rule. We were represented in the UK Parliament. But we have this sort of rose-tinctured notion of Ireland prior. He was put on trial before Lord Norbury. Who was the judge. One of my interlocutors here saying, "Oh, he said, oh, you Englishmen get in my country." I think Norbury was actually Irish too. and actually some people who were more Irish than Emmet, native Irish, would have been for the crown. So it's not the case of English versus Irish, but perhaps he was trying too hard. A case of over protestation. Anyway, so you ought to listen to or to read his a very lengthy disquisition from the dock in which he held forth about what his opinions were, why he was rebelling, what he attempted to achieve, and he very much resented this imprecation that he was somehow an agent of Gaul. He was not working for a foreign power, he was doing it for Ireland, and he said they were there to help us. Might have come to help us, but had they invaded, I would have met them on the beach. I would have immolated them in their boats. Well, he was soon going to have himself immolated. So it was an exceptionally articulate speech, and there are a few interventions by the judge in which he argues back. However, I hate to spoil this. This is a bit like Santa Claus isn't true. That speech isn't completely authentic. A lot of these are later accretions. There was whatever version that was published from the transcript of the trial, and then later on people embellished it. So they added such as improvements as occurred to them. So he wasn't quite as well spoken or quick witted as they would have us believe, and much of his posthumous reputation relies on him being perceived as being exceptionally brainy and silver tongued. Obviously, he didn't manage to talk his way off the gallows, so he was put to death in front of St. Catherine's Church, Dublin, which still stands, and he didn't want obloquy to be cast upon his character. Well, towards the end of his speech, he says, "Yes, so let no man write my like my epitaph until Ireland takes her place amongst the nations of the world." So, but Ireland joining the Comity of Nations would us to be a completely sovereign state. And well, I suppose that's actually never happened. The major portion of Ireland was independent for quite a long time, but now we're part of the European Union. It might be a splendid thing, but we're not independent. Then again, we do have the right of secession, so are we independent? Well, it's debatable. And anyway, some of Ireland's part of the United Kingdom, so the location of his grave is unknown. So the government didn't want it to be a place of pilgrimage for Republicans, or made it easier to spy on them. Whereas Wolfe Tony's predecessor, obviously, he's laid to rest in Sallins, just to the west of Dublin, there in County Kildare, and in that ruined church, well, right beside it, in that graveyard, Republicans would meet in June, I think around his birthday, last Sunday in June. The different factions of the Republican movement would meet there. So that is Robert Emmet, a fairly consequential figure. He's often been looked up to in later centuries, even though in Republican terms he achieved zilch. Apart from that speech, he got quite a few people killed, well, in the dozens, and didn't advance the Republican cause whatsoever. Seemed to be rather a dead letter for the next 40 years. There was no Republican organisation. But often Republicans say, we're not sectarian, look at Robert Emmet. But that was the odd thing, is obviously unionism had become more accepting and more broad-minded, more tolerant. With Republicanism, the opposite happened. I mean, look at all the sectarian murders that Republicans engaged in the 70s. So that's enough about Robert Emmet, since you asked. So please follow me on Twitter, Facebook, or indeed Instagram, and get online lessons with me in history, politics, English literature, religious studies, geography, international relations, law. And as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us all and everyone, indeed. And obviously get me to translate for you from French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, German, or Russian. Let me be your tour guide in London. I'm logging off now. Please keep those donations on PayPal coming. I couldn't have this channel without that. GeorgeCallahan79 at gmail.com, or indeed on Patreon. Okay, Merry Christmas.